Everyone, and welcome to the live program. My name is Rachel Hugenberg. I'm the host here. And this morning, we have Robert Coyle, who is a history professor at Lone Star Sci-Fair, who does a lot of study abroad trips with our students, who's going to come and talk to us about studying abroad and travel in Europe. All right, and for a moment, you are going to see my desktop screen while I am working on obtaining the slides. I promise it's organized. Okay, and here we go.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you virtually or through the YouTube video. It's been too long since we've had a chance to get together. I really appreciate Rachel's invitation to speak with you today. This is kind of fun. Honestly, this is a program that I had set aside for a year or so in my mind because of other things that had happened, and so it was kind of stimulating to come back to this and to remind myself of this. There was also some challenge in that most of my photography that I would draw on for the presentation is on my computer at work, where I haven't been in a year now. So I have some things, and I was able to borrow, get access to the iCloud for my teaching partner who helped me do the trip. And so we were able to pull together enough pictures that way. So I want to talk to you about travel and learning in modern Europe, specifically one study abroad program that I did in the summer of 2019. And okay, go ahead. So real quick about me, I am a student of contemporary European history, and I've made that my professional life as well as my sort of personal passion. I have degrees from Schreiner University and Marquette University, both in history. I worked on a PhD at Texas Tech University and also did a summer program at the University of Bonn in Germany. My historical interests in Europe are pretty much universal. It's hard to find something I don't enjoy. But in terms of coursework, I tended to be heavier in Germany and France, and to a lesser degree, the United Kingdom and Russia. And then my unique interest was international organizations, the League, the UN, the European Union. And when I was at Tech and I was working on a dissertation, I was looking at fisheries regulation by the United Nations organizations worldwide. Since I've been at Lone Star Sci-Fair, I've had a wonderful opportunity to be involved with not only leading, but developing and implementing study abroad. And so I've used both of my two European courses as study abroad courses on multiple occasions. The bulk of it has been the first half, the 2311, which is the ancient medieval Renaissance. And I've done that 7 times in a program we call Collegio Con Vista, which is based in Italy and is just a marvelous program. And then I've 3 other times I've been able to do the modern course. And what I want to talk about in a few minutes is some of the challenges with doing the modern course compared to the ancient course. So in 2015 and 2019, I ran the Germany-France program. In 2015, Buck Buchanan and I were working together, and he was doing an economic geography course. And we did slip in a trip to Luxembourg as well, which I was not able to do in the 2019 trip. And then in 2016, I did a trip to Sweden. So 3 times with the modern course, 7 times with the early course. But segueing now, the History 2312 is the Western civilization from 1648, and this is a mega course. It's full of big familiar topics like the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the World Wars, the Holocaust, decolonization, European unification. So many isms it's hard to even list: liberalism, conservatism, socialism, nationalism, romanticism. I mean, so many people You got Louis XIV and Peter the Great and Hitler and Stalin and Churchill and Wagner and Beethoven and Mozart and Picasso are all in this course to some degree. So it's kind of a massive course to try and approach. So the next slide. So what are the challenges with this? This is my main course. This is what I would, if I get to teach one class, I want it to be this one. And so as I imagine my favorite course in my favorite activity, which is traveling to Europe, I start to get a little nervous because there's some things that don't really fall into place very easily. The first and most obvious is the incredible geographical and logistical mismatches with the historical timeline. It's kind of hard to teach a history class too far out of order because the things all relate to each other. So it's kind of hard to take it geographically and do everything in one region and then move to the next and so forth. If you were actually following the timeline, you might be in London today, Paris tomorrow. I've got to run to St. Petersburg. Oops, better back to Paris. Wouldn't hurt to slip up to Glasgow and let's make it to Brussels and then Vienna, Manchester. I mean, you're all over the place. It's an impossible itinerary. So that's one of the huge challenges is you're immediately thinking this is just not doable. The other is all of these things in the modern course are very heavily touristed. A lot of these things that you initially think of, I call prime examples. So you need a Baroque palace to show off the old regime. You think of Versailles. I can't think of any place where I've seen bigger crowds in Europe than Versailles, except maybe Pompeii on a bad day. So we have to be aware that there are places that are simply impossible to teach because you cannot compete with the challenges of being there, the logistics, the huge crowds and all that. And as well, if you've watched the news for European travel over the last half decade, there is a growing fear in Europe of the dangers of over-tourism. Venice, Amsterdam, Paris, dozens of other smaller towns are all taking and passing laws and ordinances at the local level restricting tourism access, putting in special taxes, limiting number of overnight guests that can visit a city, that sort of thing, because they are really getting pounded by this wave of tourism. And so that's a big deal. Now, part of that is because of the next issue, which is the cost of European travel, which in general, we tend to think of European travel as really expensive, but it hasn't been. And that's been some of the excitement of it, is that we have enough money that we can raise with the students paying for the programs to be able to go more places, which means we now back to that problem of, do we go to London, then Paris, and then back to London? And I mean, it gets a little nuts. So, I don't know where this one's going, but it's certainly something you have to try and to manage as you do this. And bottom line, before we move on into the other part, is that I also have a very specific style. I like to do my own logistics. There are package tours that are available. None of them actually meet my course because they are all designed to be sort of very broad and be interdisciplinary and to be marketable to a variety of different courses. And so there are things in every one of those commercial tours that are not in my course. And so I have my students paying, and for those, premium money for things that don't drive my instruction at all, have literally nothing to do. And I have very serious ethical issues about having my students pay large amounts of money for things that aren't advancing the mission of the course. And also, I'm just kind of a control freak with my instruction, in that I don't want anything in there that isn't part of my course. As you can see from what I've talked about already, I have to leave out so much. The idea that I would not be able to do something because we're off making paella or something like that, I'm not up for that. So I prefer to do my own logistics. So this leaves this a pretty challenging and pretty messy thing to do when you start imagining 2312. It's the hardest course for me to imagine in study abroad. John. So what I've done is I've made three values decisions. First, I am going to avoid the Grand Tour. You know, the old joke that became a movie title, if this is Tuesday, then this must be Belgium. There is a real tendency to imagine that you're just going to Europe once, and so you need to go do the Grand Tour and see everything. If you can avoid that mentality and just really be comfortable with the idea that you're going to limit how many places you go, the general travel to Europe is much more satisfying as a tourist. As an instructor, it helps to break through that barrier of, wow, we just have to go everywhere. The other thing, the next values decision, is to avoid that desire to do comprehensive coverage. I can't cover everything in the course on a trip. I would love to, but that's not ideal. And in reality, I do a very good job with the course when I'm not traveling, so I know I have those tools to lean back on. And so what I do is when I imagine an individual program, I choose a handful of things that can be put together into a good itinerary, and then I just do the rest of the course with other methods instead of trying to go everywhere and see everything and cover everything all at once. And the magic of that is it does allow me to be very careful about prime examples. There are some things where it is the place, the event happened here, this is the thing to do. But in a lot of other cases, there's multiple versions of that. And you don't have to go to Versailles to see a Baroque palace. There are dozens of them in Europe. There's no one place you have to go to see a medieval castle. You know, there are multiple World War I battlefields. There's all kinds of different things you might see. And so, you know, there are art museums all over Europe. So you don't have to go to any one in particular. So moving on to the next one then. What that means is that I've come up with two ways to do this course overseas. One of which is to just simply do a light version where I pick one single city. We close out the idea that we're going to wander off anywhere else. We go one place, we stay there for a week, 10 days tops, and we do everything we can find in that one city that relates to the course, and then anything else fun that there is to do there along the way. And this was the basis of my program to Stockholm in 2016. We spent 6 nights in Stockholm, saw everything there was to see in and around Stockholm, had a marvelous time, came home. Off the top of my head, I know I could do that with Brussels, I could do it with Munich, I could probably do it with London, probably do it with Berlin. Although the bigger the capital cities are, the harder it gets because of the competition for the students' attention with all those other things that they can do. The one that I'm about to describe to you, and what Rachel asked me to focus on with our talk today, was the other approach where I do move around some, but I limit myself to a handful of anchor sites, a couple of 3-4 things that I know will be really important for the course, and they're close enough together that they can be tied together in some sort of itinerary that doesn't get crazy. And what I've found is those kinds of approaches give us a wonderful opportunity to go see a whole bunch of other stuff, and you realize you've gotten off some of those prime examples, but we've still met the learning outcomes, and it's been really good. So this is those two programs that I've mentioned in 2015 and then 2019 to Germany and France primarily. So let's go ahead and talk about the program itself. This was a second summer term, so July and August we had a couple of weeks on campus, and then we traveled for about 12 days, and then we did another week or so on campus when we got back. And as you can see from the map, I focused on what is actually a fairly small area of Northwestern Europe, which is in itself remarkable how much moving we did for something this small. But we flew in and out of Frankfurt, and we did stay in Frankfurt the last night just so that we could meet an early flight at the airport to come home. But most of the time we spent 5 nights in Bonn, traveled down to Saarbrücken with a stop in Trier, spent a couple of nights there, got off the trains, picked up a charter bus in Saarbrücken, went to Verdun, and then back to Strasbourg, and then back on the trains to get us back to Frankfurt. So just a little short tour. Most of it, half of it was spent in the city of Bonn, and then a quick make the loop around to get back to the airport from there. So what I have next is a series of slides. There's about 10 of these, and I'm just going to give you one slide each to give you a sense of where we went. And every one of these is relates to a learning outcome of some sort. So the first place we started, and I mentioned anchor points. So this program initiated from the idea that I wanted to teach this lesson in this place, and then everything else sort of built up around it. So outside of Bonn in the Eiffel Forest to the west is a little town called Kommern, and they have an agricultural museum, an open air museum that's comprised of about 5 reconstructed villages using houses that were salvaged from different regions of the Rhineland. Up until the middle of the 19th century, about 80% of the European population still lived in the rural world, still derived their income either directly from agriculture or connected to agriculture. And so for the first 200 years of this course, 80% of the population lives a daily life that's exemplified by the buildings and the activities that you can see on this this reconstructed open air museum. And they have docents, and they have we took a guided tour, and you get to see people doing things in costume, and they're still working it as a farm. And the food you eat in the restaurant at lunchtime is all grown on the farm there. And it's very, very instructive day. And so this is, it's a great way to sort of kick it off. Then moving on, the next place to go is the other side of the social question from early modern Europe, which is, of course, early modern Europe is dominated by a small aristocracy at the top of the European social structure. And so that aristocracy still has some sort of governing role deep into the 19th century across much of Europe. So here we are in Brühl, which is just a little hamlet between Bonn and Cologne. And what you're looking here at the Schlona Augustusburg is the royal palace for the Prince Archbishop of Cologne, because up until Napoleon, that part of the Rhineland was actually an independent country that was a country made out of an archdiocese of the Catholic Church. So the Archbishop was also a prince, was one of the electors of the Holy Roman Emperor, and so here is his palace. And this is a marvelous example of what I was just saying about the not doing the prime examples. You think of a Baroque palace, you think of Versailles. Well, one of the lessons of Versailles is that it inspired all of the other monarchs across Europe to copy that example. So here we are with a fairly small principality in Western Germany, and look at this beautiful Rococo palace that was, inspired by the French palaces and has many of the same motifs and all of that. Then moving on, the next place was actually out of order. I forgot that when I put this together. One of the problems with doing study abroad in Germany is that you'll end up there on a Monday, and every museum in Germany is closed on Mondays. So most historic sites and museums are no-go on Mondays. Well, we actually arrived on Saturday, toured the open air museum on Sunday. I was absolutely not going to give the students a day off just 2 days into the trip. So I had to find something to do on a Monday where everything's closed. So we went down the river, went up the river a couple hours to a little town called Rüdesheim, which is one of the most touristed spots in Germany. But in addition to the kind of fun, kitschy, touristy stuff there are some historic sites, and one of which is this monument, the Niederwald-Denkmal, which is a monument to the unification of Germany in 1870. So you've got a great representation of Germania on the top, and you've got winged war and peace on the side as angels, and you've got vision of the Prussian army, and then carved into it in the stone is is a famous poem that becomes a song called The Watch on the Rhine, which details that, Germany must unite and stand strong against the dangers of the French that are just on the other side of the river. And so this is a great place for a lesson on German unification, European nationalism, the sort of the militarism attached to that European nationalism and all that, in addition to just being a fun day where you could spend time out in the vineyards and all of that, and seeing cute little German towns and so forth. Next, one of my favorite museums in all of Europe is in Bonn. Bonn, if you remember, was the capital of West Germany during the Cold War, after World War II and before reunification. And so there's a marvelous collection of museums and things that would be appropriate for a national capital. And in Bonn, you have the Haus der Geschichte der Bundesrepublik Deutschland, which is basically the history of the Federal Republic of Germany. And it is marvelous in that you start in the ashes of World War II, and as you progress through the museum, you come through the recovery of Germany, and then the museum divides as you move through, because you have West and you have East, and so they separate in the room, and then eventually it comes back together. It ends with a wonderful lesson that the last thing that is in the museum is the news ticker. And so it is literally bringing you to the present. As you walk out of the museum, the live news headlines are running across the news wire in front of you. Really, really marvelous thing. It's full of political history, social history, pop culture, technology, pretty much everything you can imagine. It's a really beautifully put together museum, and worth your time if you happen to be in that area. Then the next thing we saw was actually a unexpected find. We had an extra day. I had planned in a bad weather day and some things like that, and ended up not needing them. And so I had a day that needed to be filled. And Sandra Harvey and I sat down and did some research, and she found this place in Cologne called the Elde House. In Germany, over the last few years, there's been an extreme concern driven by the rise of what we would call the alt-right or the extreme nationalism movement. One of my sort of philosophical thoughts is that you can't kill a bad idea, no matter how bad it is or how hard you had to work to get rid of it in the first place. It will eventually come back. And as Germans and Europeans are watching these ultra-nationalist right groups, neo-Nazi groups forming in Germany, and having an impact on their politics, they simply don't want this to happen again. And across Germany, you find a number of these new facilities opening that are called the National Socialism Documentation Centers. It's kind of the extreme in answering the accusations of fake news and the Holocaust deniers and things like that, is that, the Nazis kept records of what they did, and those documents still exist. And so these memorials and interpretive centers are opening. There was one in Berlin. It's called the Topography of Terror, which should be on your top 1 or 2 things to do if you're ever in Europe and you find yourself in Berlin. Topography of Terror is absolutely staggering in what you can learn and how complete it is in helping you understand that. These NS documentation centers, wherever possible, are built on buildings that were salvaged from the period. So this building, the Elde House, is the SS headquarters for the Rhineland in Cologne. And it was one of the very few buildings in Cologne that was not bombed. And so it was immediately reoccupied as a local government building during the occupation, and continued into the Federal Republic period as a state level government office. And they didn't do anything to renovate. They literally opened up the cell doors in the prison in the basement and filled them with filing cabinets and used them for storage. And then once the building was recovered, from that use. And they pulled all that bureaucratic apparatus out. They discovered that the notes that the prisoners had scratched into the walls of the cells were still there, had never been painted over or anything like that. And so it's just a remarkable place. It is an exhausting, very detailed look at who were the Nazis in the Rhineland, what did they do, how did they hold power, what offices did they hold, how did they implement their power. It is, if there's ever any question as to whether this story is true, you go to a place like this and you're simply staggered by how detailed what we know about this really is. So this was a surprise, and it turned out to be a really good one and a really powerful one, and I'm glad we were able to do that. Then once we finished in the Rhineland, we moved to what's called the Saarland, and we ended up with a chance to jump off the train very briefly, spend an afternoon in Trier, Germany. And the thing to see in Trier for modern European history is that's where Karl Marx was born. And so there is a museum there called the Karl Marx House, and it has an interpretation of his writings and his thought and all of that. It's kind of an interesting, kind of quirky visit, because what we don't recognize about Marx, having grown up in America and been on this side of the Cold War, is that he was actually a real oddball with a strange sense of humor. And he didn't take any of this stuff all that seriously. And so there is a little bit of sort of the playfulness of the Marx experience that you catch in Trier, which is kind of fun. It's also a really beautiful property. And then moving to the next of my, I guess, 4 big anchor points, and one of the reasons why I thought it was worthwhile to move out of Bonn and not just do a single city is that there is a preserved iron mill just outside of Saarbrücken. It's another UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it is it's spectacular. It's the Verklinger Hütte in Verklingen, which is just outside Saarbrücken. This was owned by the Rückling family. They were drivers behind a lot of the German militarism in the 19th century. If you've heard of the referral of the German foot soldier in World War I, they used to refer to them as the Stahlhelm, for the steel helmets. Well, that was actually Rückling's idea, because it allowed him to sell enormous amounts of steel to the German army. They were also major players in the Nazi Party, used substantial amounts of slave labor in their factory. So there is a very detailed memorial in there to that. And in addition to being connected to those big events, the other big event that's underneath the entire story as we do modern Europe is this incredible industrial transformation of Europe from being this continent of small farms and villages to these great cities and giant factories and all of that. And most of us simply have no idea how you make steel or you process iron or something like that. And we get to do a tour and walk through the remnants of this mill. We had a very good guide to take us through. So it was a very worthwhile part of the trip. We went from there to the next of what would be my anchor points. I have a short list of things that I've always wanted to do as a history teacher. And on that list was to teach probably my favorite European history subject, which is World War I, and teach it in the place, to sit and talk with students in and amongst the First World War. And so here we are on the battlefield at Verdun. This is actually up on the hill at Douaumont near the ossuary, the cemetery. And we had a really good day visiting Verdun and getting in touch with the First World War in that one space. 1916 was an incredible year in that there were 3 major battles in World War I that all occurred in 1916, and each of those battles had more than 1 million casualties. 2 of them were in France, one here at Verdun, and then almost simultaneously on the Somme, and then the Eastern Front, which is the Brusilov offensive. My memory slips me right now. Again, all three of those about 1 million casualties each. And so really powerful place to see that and contemplate that. The other one, if I could do it, would be Ypres in Belgium. Is probably one of the more amazing places I've seen in World War One. So that's in the back of my mind for when study abroad restarts, is I can end up in Belgium with students at some point. But this was sort of a bucket list instructional thing for me, and it worked out to be a really good day. Just two more stops. The next one, we're staying fairly heavy. We've kind of run through a series of these, that's the terrain of the modern course. There's a lot of really amazing things, and there are some very substantial things that you have to confront as you deal with the European history. One of those is, of course, the Holocaust, and you're not off the hook by not going to Eastern Europe, not going to Poland. There is actually a concentration camp that the Nazis built in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France. And so not too far outside of Strasbourg, you can stop and visit an actual concentration camp, the Natzfelder-Struthof camp. This was not an extermination camp like they had in Poland. It was a work camp designed to quarry pink granite or red granite that was being used in the construction of the Nazi Party headquarters facilities in Nuremberg. And so they were using the slave labor in these camps. This one was used primarily for members of the resistance. It was part of the Nazi program of Nacht und Nebel, the night and fog, where they simply made resistance members disappear, arrested in front of their families and never heard from again. They were sent up onto this mountainside to live in these horrible conditions and quarry this granite stone. So again, a very powerful stop. And then the last stop on the travels then brings us into Strasbourg. And I do this on purpose. I know that these things get pretty heavy, get pretty emotionally challenging. They're rough for me to teach, and they are definitely a challenge for the students, some of whom are contemplating these things for the very first time. So we visit Strasbourg, and we were able to arrange a guided tour of the European Parliament. They have a very vigorous educational outreach facility, and so when I contacted them and let them know I was bringing early university students, they set up a special day program for us free of charge, and we got to tour the European Parliament. And part of why I like to do that, other than my passion for international organizations and European unification as a topic, is the current interpretation that Europe is using for its history. History interpretations change. The current one is that the foundation for contemporary Europe is human rights. And so they're telling a story that Europe learned its lesson in the misery of World War II and the horrible things that happened, and that starting from there blossomed a commitment to human rights that has now begun to spread deeply throughout the continent and is driving very much everything. And that is reinforced in practically everything you see in and around the European quarter of Strasbourg. And so that was a particularly interesting visit. All right, so just a couple of thoughts then to close out the program before we throw it open for questions and pictures and things like that. I initially titled this slide Challenges and Opportunities, and then when it dawned on me was actually this was the case where the challenges became opportunities. And so there were some fairly unique instructional things that happened as a result of this. The first and most obvious one, go ahead and change slide, is that I ended up with too many classes. I needed one class in the summer, summer two, to make load for the year. And knowing that the study abroad was a long shot, I had an online section of the same course built for the same term, so that if the study abroad did not make, I would make my load and I would still get to teach this course at this time in the summer. Well, it took so long to get all the approvals through the process this time that we actually, and we forgot to close the course. We ended up with a full online class and then a study abroad class that made it. And Dean Kelly Gernhardt, a number of you have met him or worked with him at various times, was my dean at the time. And he said, go for it, do them both, come up with something creative. If you think you can handle the work, go ahead and do it. And so I decided to try and integrate those two very different approaches to teaching the course um, since I had the opportunity to do them at the same time. So part of my online course is that I have a virtual study abroad. My students, in addition to doing everything else they do in the online class, they do virtual field trips to some of these same places. There's about 10 in the course. 3 of them were places we were going on that itinerary. We were going to Verklingen, we were going to the Open Air Museum, going to Verdun. My online students are going to Auschwitz. My in-person students are going to Nazi-Village-Struthof. They're doing all the same readings, same books, including the biography of Marx that I had them read. So what I did is I reorganized that activity in my online class so that those 2 events were happening basically on the same day. So if my online students were going to Verklingen, they would go to Verklingen around the same, usually just a few hours before we would be going to Verklingen in person. Before they went to Kommern, we went to Kommern, they were there just a few hours before virtually. And what I had them do was then share between the 2 classes. What I decided I wanted to do was to see if I could share my personal experience a little more richly into the online class, but then also have the students interact with each other across the 2 classes wherever possible. So for my own part, I did a daily video log of my travels and of the visiting these places, and I posted those into the online class pretty much on a daily basis, just 2 minutes here, 5 minutes there, letting them see this and make it as real as I could for them. And then I offered extra credit to my online students if they would submit questions about these places that we were visiting. And then I offered extra credit to my study abroad students if they would answer those questions on video and let me post it back into the class. And then there were a couple of days where we were both doing the same activity when we were all on campus, and I invited the online students to come in and join the on-campus class for those activities. So I did what I could to promote some interaction amongst, between the 2 courses, and it worked out pretty well. The other challenge is that I do a term paper in this course, and that's not practical when you're in Europe for 40% of the term. There's just no writing a term paper, and so I had to give them a different assignment. And so the big end of course activity, and this is the one I absolutely do not have any pictures of here, they're all on my computer at the office, is that I had the students do what are called poster presentations. One of the big things that's been happening in academic conferences is instead of reading papers or standing up with a PowerPoint, you make a trifold, very detailed trifold poster, and you do a 5 or a 10-minute presentation based on that poster. And so I assigned each of the locations that we visited to one of the 10 students on the course, and then they made a presentation about the instructional activity. What did they learn from visiting that spot? And so it wasn't so much, hey, we went here and we did this and it was pretty and look at these flowers, but we went here because we needed to learn about the Holocaust. We went here because we needed to learn about European unification, things like that. And so it was a really good set of presentations. I was actually very proud of the students who did that. I think Rachel was there for
Yes, I got to come and see them, and one of the girls who had, I think she had the French concentration or the French work camp, had actually reconstructed the outer structure of her poster to look like the gate entrance. It was really interesting because each of the students got a chance to talk about where they went, and you could tell that they understood the history with a better depth.
It was a real challenge. It seems on the first blush like it's a little less work than hitting the library and writing a term paper, but it actually meant they had to do some pre-research and some post-research, and it changed how that student approached that visit on that day. What went in their journal was different than what everybody else was doing in the journal because they were responsible for making presentations, and they of course had to meet with me individually to go through their place and all of that. The final challenge is turned into an absolute opportunity, and that is that we changed our approach to staffing study abroad right about the time that this happened. When I did the Sweden trip in 2016, I went completely by myself. I was only teaching one course, was not a learning community. I thought it was going to be small. I ended up with 17 students. And I did a week in Stockholm by myself with 17 people, which I was able to do. But now I would be approved for that. Starting in the summer of 2019, the system changed its guidelines and says you must have no fewer than one faculty member for every 10 students. So once you get that 11th student, you need a second faculty member on the program. And so I went ahead and budgeted for 2, and 10 to 12 was our target. I think the chancellor was actually asking for 8 at one point, one faculty member for every 8 students. And so I have the extraordinary good fortune that if you were to imagine the most qualified person in the history department to participate in traveling with students and leading a project like this, it would be Dr. Sandra Harvey, who at the time was chair of the history department, had worked with students through Phi Theta Kappa and the Student Government Association and a number of things like that. She's a multi-time presenter here on the Life program, so a lot of you know her. Anyway, that's my wife. So when it came down to, well, who do you want to go with you? It's like, well, I got a list with one name on it. I don't need anybody else. If she decides not to go, then I'll solve that problem. But anyway, and this worked out beautifully. It was a lot of fun for us personally, but from the teacher side of this is just hysterical. This is me playing dirty a little bit because Sandra is so personable. She is so warm and so fuzzy, and everybody just loves Sandra, and the students just cling to her anyway. And she wasn't grading them, so she was safe. They could go talk to her at any time because she didn't have to grade any of their papers. But I knew the places that we were going that this was going to push her buttons. She teaches modern American history, but she's teaching the same topics in her survey courses. She's fanatically interested in World War II and also very passionate in women's history. And so as we went through these places, it just really set her off. And so I would be handling some logistical thing. I'd be buying train tickets or making arrangements to get us into somewhere or whatever. And I'd look over and there's my 10 students just clustered around Sandra, and they're all just talking and just going and just really into it. And I'd walk over and they're talking history. She's like, well, if you read such and such and you do this, and I'm thinking they're getting hours and hours and hours of extra history instruction, and they have no idea that it's happening to them. So this was kind of fun for me. Plus, again, we did get to travel together with the students and all of that. So anyway, I practiced this somewhere between 30 and 55 minutes. And so what I have next is just some just for the fun of it pictures of the trip. I can either pause now for questions, or I can kind of walk you through the slideshow, or some combination of both, whatever you would like for me to do.
Why don't we address questions as they pop up?
Okay.
That way, we can stop and give an answer, but we also give people some time to think of some of their questions.
Okay. All right. So this is all from Sandra's phone camera, actually. This next handful of slides, I just kind of grabbed some at random, sort of showing what it was like. So here's some pictures of us actually traveling, flying into Frankfurt on KLM. And one of, I don't want to know how many trains we rode. We did a lot of train rides, but and I'm okay with that because I like the students to be comfortable traveling and feel like they know how to travel in Europe and to travel the way the Europeans travel. And so I'm excited when we have a chance to use public transportation. I don't really like the charter bus, even though it's convenient. I like the students to learn the mechanism of the travel as well. So contrast on the social side of it, we have the farm at the Open Air Museum in Kommern, and we have the palace in Brühl. And I'm thinking the picture on the right is probably a student picture that got emailed to Sandra or texted to Sandra, because that's us in it. That's me and Sandra walking. So that must be a student picture that was sent to us. I didn't realize that until I just saw it big. That horse was standoffish this time. When we took students there in 2015, that horse was the star of the show, came right to the fence, and everybody got to pet it and talk to it. Was not in the mood that day. So.
Rachel Evans has asked, are there any websites, books, or other types of sources that you would like us to have a look at? Sorry.
I am, in my own personal taste, I'm kind of moving away from the paper.
Would you recommend to someone interested in planning a tour to Europe someday?
Yeah. I do my planning using just a handful of tools, almost all of them from Google. Google Maps, YouTube videos, and then access to train schedules and things like that. The German railway site, Deutsche Bahn, which is Bonn, BAHN.com, has the master train schedule for all of Western Europe. So from Poland and Romania to the Atlantic Ocean, if it runs on rails, that site has the schedule for it. And so I normally do that. I've become a big fan of, I've always been kind of a Rick Steves fan, and it was kind of fun when he visited the campus 10 years ago and got a chance to meet him. But he's got some really valuable tips for traveling in Europe. In addition to his ability to show you the neat places, his ideas about traveling light and picking sort of off the beaten path things and getting out of the crowds are really important, I think, for people's ability to enjoy Europe. YouTube is just full of great stuff now. People are you can literally envision the trip if you get buried in those things as well. What else do we have here?
Thanks, that's helpful to know. I have to head out from reading, but I really enjoyed the program a lot.
Thanks, it was nice to see you. So again, just some action shots of the students. The horse wasn't cooperative this time, but April definitely managed to get that sheep's attention and spent some time doing some ear scratching there. That was good. I love the visit to the Open Air Museum. You have all these students that have grown up in the suburbs of Cyprus or in North Houston or somewhere, and drop them on a farm, and you realize you feel something on your foot while you're eating lunch, and there's a chicken under your table and stuff like that. That just isn't your normal Houston experience. It's kind of fun to have those sensations. Let's see, from there we go to this next one. A lot of it is in the museum in Bonn. Again, moving down to the next slide here. There it is. So in the 50s, again, Sandra loves everything 50s. They had talked about the soda fountain culture there. in Germany, and so they actually have a replica soda fountain in there. Which, compare that to the upper right-hand picture. I talk about the museum there starting in the rubble at the end of the war, and one of the things I learned in a class somewhere was something referred to the Trümmerfrauen, the women of the rubble. And it's hard to actually imagine that, with 3.5 or 4 million German men in the prisoner of war camps, and the first year or so of the post-war period, no interest in any rebuilding, and no money coming in or anything. You have millions of women in these completely bombed out cities of Germany, trying to survive. And what is remarkable is they just decided it was time to sweep up. And so they just started right there in their neighborhood and just started sweeping up. And along the way, they salvaged all the bricks that were not broken from buildings being knocked down in the bombing. And they just started stacking them up so they could be reused. And it's an amazing story of these people near starvation, waiting on Europe to decide what it was going to be like after the war. And they just start sweeping up. And then is one of my students there at the mock-up of the original German Parliament, West German Parliament building, that was there in Bonn. And so she's at the rostrum, ready to make a speech for us. Let's see. Moving down, we've got some more museum pictures. There's a green Trabant coming through, some remnants of the Berlin Wall. One of my students was fascinated by the hippie bus with the plastic marijuana hanging from the windows as curtains. More palace garden kinds of things. Kind of move through these a little faster. We're just about to the end of our time. Pictures from the Elde House in Cologne. Just two comments on this. One, if you look up here in the upper right, you'll see that, three of my students, a lot of the detail is stuff that would have been like in photo albums and little pieces of paper and individual documents. And what you don't realize is how hungry the students are to learn. Probably more than half of the class literally went through and looked at every one of those thousands of pictures and thousands of documents. We were in there for hours, and they went through not just doing the audio tour, but reading every poster, every sign, looking at every display, just absorbing every molecule of that they could get. And then this is one of Sandra's favorite things. Down in the lower right is an actual ballot from a German election during the Nazi period. And you'll notice the only option on the ballot is the National Socialist Party and Hitler. And what Sandra really loves about this one is that somebody, instead of checking it off, wrote in no in there. So here is a protest vote. Someone said Nein. We don't want Herr Hitler and Herr Goering and Herr Goebbels to be our rulers. So that's an interesting artifact there. Just moving down, one of the fun things to do in Cologne, there is a chocolate factory. So I'm kind of, just for the fun of it, we go see the chocolate factory. We climb to the top of the Cologne Cathedral. That was pretty cool. They did. I didn't. I'm smarter than that. I've done it once, and I don't have any intention to do that again. Then moving down, I've got a couple of pictures. One is the courtyard of Karl Marx house with its beautiful geraniums, and the other is the front door of the city hall, the old historic city hall building in Bonn, the Altes Rathaus. And for fun, I've got a couple of pictures of us touring the iron mill. There was an art exhibit. Somebody had been making these little statues of this worker guy, and had just sort of been leaving him standing all around. And I realized the pictures of us touring the mill resemble the art that was being displayed in the mill at the same time. So I thought that was kind of fun. And then moving down, two thoughts on the Vosges. First of all, we got a surprise driving in on the bus. We started realizing the jerseys were there. If anybody's a fan of the Tour de France, This road we drove to get into the concentration camp was on the fifth stage of the 2019 Tour de France, and we began realizing we were about 3 weeks behind them, but all the villages were still decorated. They still had all the stuff up, and so we started realizing, wow, we're on the tour route. But even on the other side, though, there are a few places in Europe as beautiful as the Vosges Mountains of Alsace. They are absolutely spectacular. It's kind of like the Appalachian Mountains, the Great Smokies. The hills. They have forest all the way to the top of them. They're really beautiful, but I can't ever think of that beauty without imagining having to look at it through the wire of a concentration camp. And so I've made my personal vow to myself that I will never photograph that landscape without a little bit of the barbed wire in it, because that lesson can't ever be forgotten. So finishing up with about 3 slides in Strasbourg. Lots of chances to do new things, go to the European Parliament, see the beautiful city of Strasbourg, and if you're Haley, you get a chance to eat your first escargot. And so we did. We realized about a week into it that we weren't going to spend all the money, and I needed to spend all of the students' money on them. And so it was like, guys, pick a place, order what you want. Normally I would do a fixed price. Okay, you get a salad and this. That last 3 or 4 days, which of course we were in France, it was like, we'll order whatever. And so they want to try escargot, we order escargot, because it's their money and they needed to spend it on them. So that was fun for them to do those kinds of things. And then here we are at the European Parliament. Again, just a really fabulous day to close out the program with a chance to do that. And then actually the closeout day was I had one extra day that was reserved in case we needed something else. And so the students got their one rest day, their one day off in Strasbourg, of all places. And so I just love Strasbourg. It's one of my favorite European cities. It is so beautiful. The food is so good. It's so French and German at the same time. It's the capital of Europe. And you know, there's a metro stop in Strasbourg. Where you get off the metro to go up to see the Parliament. The metro stop is called Human Rights. Again, what a remarkable thing to show our students as we go to visit. And then we close out with just pictures of what it's like to be in Strasbourg, which is, again, just pretty special stuff.
All right, we do have a couple of messages here for you. Thanks. It's very helpful to know. I have to head out, and I enjoyed it. Pieces of the Wall. I enjoyed seeing the pictures in the program, learned a lot. So glad to see you have overcome the COVID-19 bump in your classes, able to use the trip in your future classes. Much enjoyed the presentation and the historic photos. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us, and it's been a fun trip across Europe. Part of the reason why today's actually National Holocaust Remembrance Day. So seeing, parts of the world where this is something very remembered and this is something that our students experience is very powerful and very important to me.
I've had the pleasure, go back about 3 years on my own. I was traveling, doing some research, and I encountered this topography of terror that I mentioned in Berlin. I cannot emphasize enough that to understand these events, the details of that, the methodologies they used, how they literally transformed the norms in a society, and the consequences became just simply uncontrollable and catastrophic. Then a couple of days later, after a long bus ride, I had a chance to make my one visit to Auschwitz. And so I was able to connect those two things. And if that is a topic that is on your list of things to know as an adult, then those two places are very definitely worth visiting. I've been to Auschwitz once, I've been to Dachau a couple of times, and I've been to Struthof now, Struthof a couple of times. The one in Alsace, Struthof, for me has always been more emotionally powerful. I had trouble in Dachau the very first time, and I've had trouble both times at Struthof. Auschwitz was not, and so again, if you're worried about the emotional impact that it might have on you, Auschwitz is a very controlled environment. Obviously, they have to have control because the possibility that someone might attempt to destroy that place is certainly there, and so it is the most professional, and they're also aware of the emotional impact that it could have, and so Auschwitz is a much easier visit than you might expect it to be, and it is huge. It is a massive visit, massive site, massive amount of information, all of that. The one in France is very useful in telling the story and helping you to remember, and is again a spectacular visit. I think something you can manage in 2 to 3 hours with a group of students, and I think works very well in a course.
Yeah. Thank you for being here with us today and for giving us a little taste of what studying abroad across Europe would be like. I know we're all kind of stuck at home right now, so even seeing folks being able to travel someplace really interesting and fun and an educational experience. We appreciate you being with us so much. Next week, we are going to have in Shannon Garza, and she is the owner of the jewelry company Woman X on the Moon. And she's going to be talking about building businesses and building communities of color with us. So do join us next week at 10 a.m. Thank you so much, and we will see you guys next week.
Thank you.